Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Guru Podcast, featuring insights from artists and professionals of color. On today's podcast, we'll have a conversation with engineer-turned-poet Bryant O'Hara. His poetry has been published in the Pandemic Atlanta 2020, Starline Magazine, and the Eyedrum Periodically. Today, he's going to talk about his new book of speculative poetry entitled The Ghettobirds. So stay tuned for another informative episode of the Urban Guru Podcast. Let's go back a little bit. So you said you were kind of always interested in writing. When did it first occur to you that you wanted to be a writer? Did you write things when you were younger?
Yeah, I did. I recall doing some writing even in elementary school. I mean, I like doing it. I like trying to create stories. Obviously, as a kid, they weren't all that great, but I like reading stories as well as
Mm-hmm.
writing them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my interest in writing had waxed and waned over the years, depending on where I was, physically, and where my interest took me.
Mm-hmm.
When by the time I got into high school, I was taking you know advanced placement English classes and creative writing classes. So
Mm-hmm.
once I started doing that, I got really interested because I started to get a little bit more into the technical aspects of trying to write. So once I
Mm-hmm.
knew there were different ways of writing,
Mm-hmm.
different formats, that took my interest for a while as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, were you also an avid reader when you were younger?
Oh yeah, of course it starts at home. So in our home, my mom and dad had purchased two sets of encyclopedias,
Mm-hmm.
not the fancy, Encyclopedia Britannicas. My dad was a Marine; he couldn't afford that. But we did have was like the New World Book of Knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and there was some other one too. I can't remember its name, but the main one was like the New World Book of Knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And we had like some Time Life books,
Mm-hmm.
and so what I was always really curious about something, so I'd start trying to read something or I'd ask a question, and both my parents would say, "Well, you got two sets of encyclopedias. Go look it up." I don't know. Can you give me a hint? It's like, yeah, sure. We'll give you a hint for a little while. After that, you're on your own.
So do you consider your parents, were they your first inspiration in terms of your writing and your creativity when you were younger?
Yeah, yeah. I think both my parents really definitely encouraged me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my dad was definitely into um, building mechanical things. He had a set of model airplanes.
Oh, wow.
Before they had the remote control airplanes,
Mm-hmm.
they'd have those ones that were basically you could kind of guide them, but they were basically on a long wire, and you basically
Oh,
you just had to
yes.
you just they just spun around and around, and you could kind of
Mm-hmm.
manipulate them, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, with these wires that would adjust the ailerons and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So you came by your interest in engineering or mechanical things naturally as a young person with your dad and his model planes and stuff. Did that contribute to you considering being an engineer?
Oh yeah, yeah, most definitely.
Okay.
um though I mean, we I never really got a chance to use a lot of his tools because he was usually very strict on the use of them.
Mhm.
uh and I think that sort of kind of keeping me from the tools, early in life, just kind of made me more curious about wanting to use them. So,
Mhm.
when I had the opportunities to take, either industrial arts or shop class,
Mhm.
I tried to take them when I could.
It seems like your approach was very practical. Like you said, you noticed the different types of writing and the technicality of the writing and stuff. So again, your mind kind of goes to the technical aspect of it. I'm curious, when did you settle on poetry as opposed to becoming a short story writer or a novelist, or do you do all three of those things?
Um, I'd never done novels. I had
Hmm.
tried my hand at short stories, but at the time I felt like I just wasn't sustaining the narrative enough
Hmm.
to make it work.
Hmm.
Poetry came, easier because,
Hmm.
again, because of the structure, And even when you started doing free verse, it was easier to impose a structure.
Mm-hmm.
By the time, I mean, I did write some short stories. I had to write some as
Mm-hmm.
part of my graduation uh, from college. The second major I actually had to do the equivalent of like a thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And so this project that I had to do, this thesis, was basically a collection of short stories.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
what really kind of got me interested in doing poetry again was the rise of the poetry slams around the early 90s. I think it was
Okay.
really starting to kind of kick off.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to go to a couple of things, especially when I left Massachusetts to come back to Atlanta. That was one of the first things I was trying to do, was just find new places to read poems and kind of sharpen the saw, as it were, I guess.
So you would look for places to read. So you were testing out your poetry. You were seeing the reaction of the audience.
Yeah, I was trying to experiment with different styles.
Mm-hmm.
And once the style that I kind of hit on
Mm-hmm.
before I graduated was, I guess what they call a cut up style. I I was reading a lot of William S. Burroughs, and I really kind of liked the idea of one of the techniques he was kind of more famous for, which is taking pre-existing texts and physically chopping them up and then rearranging them, and then basically reading it back as if it were a unified thing, which can produce some very wild
Uh-huh.
um, non-narratives, I would call them. But as I started playing with that idea, I started also listening to a few other authors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, by that time, another one was like Russell Edson,
Mm-hmm.
and his poetry was very absurd. I mean, he wrote things about like cows and hamburger devices, and they were just. I mean, I think I picked one of his cassettes at random from. I was like at the Harvard bookstore
Mm-hmm.
once, and I was looking for some audio recording of poetry and or any sort of literature, and somebody handed me this tape, and it was called a performance at Hog Hill, I think it was. And so I was listening to it, and my first thought was, "What in the world is this guy doing?" And I was laughing my ass off because it was so freaking funny and just absurd. And so combining those two influences at the time, I started trying to see where I could kind of go in that vein. Needless to say, my first attempts at doing this did not go very well. When among the first poetry venues I go to is Club Kaumba down in the West End,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't. I mean, people were a little bit interested. It was strange, and all, but I think I really felt like a fish out of water when I first got there,
Mm-hmm.
because it was 93 when I moved back to Atlanta. So there's the main two things that are going on at that time were, you know, Atlanta's like physically gearing up for the Olympics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, we're in like sort of like the heyday of the Afrocentric movement at the time. And here I was, this engineering geek with a degree in technical writing, coming in with some weird ass style of poetry reminiscent of some beat author and some dude from Connecticut. Needless to say, it was like a space shuttle. Just, it was a complete flyby.
When you get to Ghettobirds, by now you've adopted your style.
Yeah. Well, it came about because of that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was, trying to figure out what can I say here that
Mm-hmm.
would mean anything to the audience
Mm-hmm.
that I was putting myself in front of. And eventually it kind of hit on me that, okay, I'm into science fiction, particularly hard science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
with an engineering background, but the topics that people are talking about, were talking about at the time, and to extent still are, seem like completely different, until I realized, okay, funk. It just kind of hit me as I was listening. I think I was probably listening to some Earth, Wind, and Fire or something on the way home. And I realized, oh, okay, I can do this. just I just need to kind of channel that sort of vibe, mix the science fiction with the sort of the rhythm and the whimsy of, and kind of the built-in optimism of funk in its heyday.
Nature is a bad mother, half raising one bastard species after another, dropping them into an ongoing explosion, saying, make your way, after sashaying down the eons to drop off a load of kids.
So that's when I started really kind of leaning into that idea, and that's when sort of people started kind of paying attention, and the Ghettobirds kind of grew out of that.
We're talking about your process. So when you're composing a piece, are you actively thinking of funk?
A lot of times it's definitely what I'm listening to, and at times
Mm-hmm.
I will kind of try to catch some aspect of it
Mm-hmm.
in written form.
Yeah.
So yeah, at times I'll try to figure out what the cadence is,
Mm-hmm.
and translate that into poetic meter,
Mm-hmm.
and see, can I get close to that? What can I, if I can't get close, what can I do based on it?
Because it was interesting. I know when we were talking about it, and I was telling you that I was reading through Ghettobirds. I would do like 1 or 2 pieces a night.
Mm-hmm.
And it finally dawned on me, it's like you really should read them out loud.
Yeah, that's why I'm working on the audiobook. Every single one of these have been read out loud initially.
And it's different, and you feel it, and it gives you a different intensity than just reading it silently. And so from then on, I would just read them out loud. And so is that what you really want? Is that what you want the people to buy the book to do? Do you want them to read it out loud so they can feel that?
You know what? I hadn't thought about that. I mean, usually when people ask me, I do say these poems were they were written and then they were spoken. And
Mm-hmm.
I basically adjusted the poems to sound the way I want them to sound when spoken. So that might
Mm-hmm.
actually be something to put in. It's like, you know what? To best enjoy these things, read them aloud.
Yeah.
Read them to yourself, read them in the
Uh-huh.
car, just read them out loud.
And you know what Mama Nature always says? You fix it or you buy it. I ain't got time for your bullshit. After sashaying down the eons, drop off a load of kids. A lot of them do buy it, or jerry-rig an adaptation. But humankind? Oh no. This little knucklehead actually has the indignation to talk back to its mama like it's grown. To get up in her face and raise its voice at her, saying, I'll fix it and I'll break this world to do it if I have to. And then I'm getting off this rock, cause I got better places to be than under a couple of meters of deep blue sea, cause I ain't got time for your bullshit. And nature, bad mother that she is, looks humankind in its collective eyes and says, I dare you.
I saw your video
Mm-hmm.
on your unboxing.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The first poems that make up the Ghettobirds were written in the 90s. Probably
Wow.
some of the oldest ones in there are
Mm-hmm.
like Mariah Pariah is
Mm-hmm.
probably the oldest, followed by the Heavy Cranes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those were written, yeah, pretty early on. They'd gone through some iterations, but I mean Mariah Pariah's in particular definitely has I've changed some aspects of it, particularly like the choruses a couple of times.
So why did it take so long for you to get down to this point?
My first active set of years were between 93 and 97. And I mean, I had started, it was around that period that I first kind of came up with the concept of the Ghettobirds. I wrote several earlier poems that actually aren't in the book. At some point, I'm gonna take those out and dust them off and clean them up. And I started, it's like actively trying to just read them wherever I could read them in open mics. I mean, I guess I didn't really feel sufficiently confident to start really trying to put a collection together. In 96, I got married.
Now, your wedding was traditional.
No, well, yes and no. It was relatively traditional. I mean, mine was at a Unitarian Universalist church.
Okay.
But they had we had an African percussion choir as part of that church. It was it was called Thurman Hamer Ellington Unitarian Universalist. It was basically one of the first, as far as that, and maybe one of the only churches in the Unitarian Universalist denomination that was really trying to aim at being a little more on the Afrocentric side.
Okay.
So, but still with adhering to the principles, which are pretty broad. And yeah, in our wedding, I was in the choir. I mean, I was actually playing a bass drum called a June. And so my wife came in first. And so I handed the sticks to the one of the other players and then walked up to the aisle. And later on in 96, I had my first child, my son. And I think at that point, it was kind of like that conversation I had with my mom. Am I going to go this way and pursue the arts and poetry? Or am I going to go this way and, focus on, actually getting my career as a technical writer moving? And I made the choice. I went the choice for the practical. I did write, but I wrote a lot less often. And I really didn't start writing more in earnest until mid 2000s, early 2010s. Had a group of people that I could, read and get, bounce ideas off of. And there were still, open mic venues around at the time. As I made more time, as I felt like I had more time, that's when I started getting more and more involved. And believe me, throughout that entire 20-something year period, my wife Alice was telling me, when are you going to publish this damn book? you have everything you need. Just publish the damn thing. And finally, I actually listened to her, which I should have done earlier. And I did. And I was actually going to self-publish it initially. Because again, I didn't know who was taking, science fiction poetry with a funk influence. One of my fellow writers from one of those groups recommended I try this particular publisher, Frayed Edge Press. I said, okay, sure. She said, she's gonna love it, really. And I was like, all right, but if I don't hear anything back in X number of days, I'm pulling the trigger on this and self-publishing. Lo and behold, before that time period was up, I got an acceptance. So that's how it came about.
We built a badass boom box to hear a billion-year bass drop at the end of a binary black hole swing. You drop a needle on the record and the eons might just sing. In this moment, playing in the key of B, we, the matter, we throw our hands to the stars and wave at waves. We built a badass boom box to hear a billion-year bass drop at the end of a binary black hole swing. You drop a needle on the record and the eons might just sing.
Now, do you want to tell the audience what is a Ghettobirds? Because I mention it to people all the time. They say Ghettobirds, and you can see the question in their face. It's like, what's that?
Yeah. Well, the first time I heard the word was I was riding with my brother down, I think it's International Boulevard. It used to be Stewart Avenue. I think he was playing a song from NWA called Ghettobird. And okay, we were nodding our heads to it. And I was thinking, all right, so it's Ghettobird. And of course, I'm thinking of the sound of the word and and how I found that the word itself fascinating. And so I just turned to my brother and asked him the same question. And then everybody asked me, he's like, what the hell is a Ghettobird? And he said, it's a police helicopter. Because of course, in South Central, what's the main bird you're going to see? It's a man-made one. So now, once I had the term in my head, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with it, and it took probably another 6 to 9 months before I figured out what I was going to do. I was visiting someone's apartment, and they had an art collection, and I was looking at some of the things they had, and they had a stylized picture of a guy who's like, in this, don't hurt me pose, and there's this helicopter type object shining a beam on that person. And I was thinking, okay, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run with the idea of the Ghettobirds as sentient beings. I was thinking along the lines of Transformers at the time, but then I just started, playing more and more with the idea of them being sort of composite entities. They can kind of like incorporate people a little bit like the Borg, but for a beneficial purpose.
We await the stomps that shake the dance halls of space-time. We brace for the booms that become the bips that thunder across the void. And we clap our hands to the clave of the cosmos long gone. We built a badass boom box to hear a billion-year bass drop at the end of a binary black hole swing. You drop a needle on the record and the eons might just sing. In this moment, playing in the key of C, we, the matter, do matter. We nod our heads and raise our ever-changing sticks. We built a badass boom box to hear a billion-year bass drop at the end of a binary black hole swing. You drop a needle on the record and the eons might just sing. You drop a needle on the record and the universe might just sing. We hear a tiny needle drop on a great big record, and we hope that the deep times swing.
If you were going to put together a chronology within this Ghettobird universe, or there's a few thousand years in between the first story, which I would consider to be the Heavy Cranes, and closer to one of the end pieces, which would be Hoop Dance. Because I mean, the whole point behind the Ghettobirds is they want to help humanity become a spacefaring civilization. The stories, the poems, basically kind of are snapshots of where they are in that process. So I could put plenty of things in it. So there's a lot of room. And both before and after.
And you mentioned earlier that you were recording some of these. Are you going to put out, are you going to do them like individual, or are you going to put out a audiobook collection, audiobook of the whole collection?
Yeah, I am putting together an audiobook. I've done like the first round of recordings, and so they're all of them are recorded in some way, shape, or form. There's a few that are older. I'm probably gonna have to re-record so that they actually match the text in the book, because some of them have changed significantly enough that I would need to re-record them. One thing I'd been kind of on the fence about was whether to just do a straight reads versus incorporating background sound or music.
Some of these are so cosmic, and scale and stuff. That would be really interesting. I mean, because you have the one, was it We Drink Between the Stars?
Yeah.
It's like, and the ones like the rings of Jupiter, and the communication between the satellites and stuff. It's like some of it's very
bargains with Aurora and the Borealis.
Yeah, it's like, wow. That would be really interesting to see what you almost like a sound design.
Well, actually, the first attempts I did at recording some of these, and that was the other thing that kind of prompted me to do more work, was one of my adopted sons had turned me on to this service that was an early service at the time called SoundCloud. And he was using it just to kind of upload notes, for things. And I saw the potential for not only uploading my poetry just to kind of preserve it, but also to kind of, play with the form. And for a while, there was a collection of groups within SoundCloud. They used to have groups that were devoted to this idea called digital audio poetry, which was, it wasn't merely, record your poem and then upload it, right? It was like, take your poetry and actually treat it almost like you would do the production of music, where you were adding like effects, multiple background sound design. I mean, yeah, you could put music in there too, or even song. But the idea is you were utilizing the tools available in that medium to kind of enhance the words.
How far out do you think before we have something?
Well, I'm hoping sometime in the spring.
Okay.
That's kind of what I'm aiming for. And given my habit of procrastinating, probably the thing that I'm going to do is just make an announcement, set a date, and basically
And
force myself to
in.
hit that date. It's worked before.
What do you hope people get out of this book, either when they hear it and or they buy it and read it or read it out loud? What are you hoping that they get out of this? What do you want to leave with them?
The things that I present are, on the whole, presenting a relatively optimistic future, albeit a very strange one. But the idea is learning how to be okay with that.
Yeah.
Like things like, Pigeon Police, or even The Silent Station, where you have Marta as this, think of it as essentially like a rogue AI that's decided it has its own rules of how things work. But things run. It just, humans aren't the only things in the loop. And I've always been kind of guided by, and even when the type of science fiction that I enjoy has, at the end of the day, an optimistic tone. One of my favorite stories is from Ray Bradbury. It's called the Toynbee Convector. And guy does a press conference, says he's gone 100 years into the future and everything works. And Brand shows the world evidence that, yeah, we clean the air, save the whales, fix the climate, you name it, we did it right. And 100 years later, sure enough, it all happened. People were like, we did it. And so on the 100th anniversary, because this guy is still alive, given life extension, he authorized one person to interview him on the day he's supposed to basically meet his younger self via the time machine. Once they count down the time that his younger self is supposed to meet, the time hits 0. He turns to the reporter and says, I lied. Made the whole thing up. And the guy's like, why? And he says, because in his time, the world was full of despair. And he felt that if a world that had no hope for the future would not build one. So he tried to provide some hope, give him something to aim for. That's the spirit in which I wrote these pieces and try to write others. If you believe the world is going to hell in a handbasket, then in some way, shape, or form, you are helping to build the basket. So, but if you believe things are going to get better or will be better, then you're going to, in some way, shape, or form, move that needle along.
It's a really cool message to say, because I think sometimes, particularly with science fiction, it's become so dystopian and, or alien invasion or whatever. I think there's very few that's really optimistic about a future.
Well, dystopia is easy. Just take a look at the world around you and go, yeah, if this goes on, that's all you have to ask. What if this goes on? You can get a lot of mileage out of that. I guess the real problem is that when you want to write something that is optimistic, you got to kind of tread lightly, because there's always the danger of becoming utopian, which can be just as disingenuous as dystopian. So at least nowadays, I think it's a little bit harder to write stuff that is more optimistic. It can be done. I'm sure it is being done. It's just not as popular as Doom with 3 O's. Having things end on a better note than they start, it's a bit of a challenge, you know. I mean, all stories have to, if they're going to be any good, they have to have conflict in them. So dystopian stuff just piles that conflict on. I mean, it's like, I think the one example I found of one that kind of does aim for the more positive one was Arrival.
Oh my gosh, yes.
That, I mean, one,
Yes.
it's a great example of what I would consider hard science fiction.
Yes, it is.
The linguist is the hero. And just the things that wind up happening, and she's trying to achieve this goal despite conflict building up around her, you know, and she succeeds. And that, I mean, to me, that's an example of some, what I consider relatively pretty optimistic, you know. Everybody winds up coming out better for it. Some of the newer stuff I've been writing has been kind of incorporating more of those, I guess what I call them more than streets. The things like good Lord, now I'm blanking on the title. It's the one with Peachtree Street.
Okay.
As as sort of like a sentient entity. And it just, you kind of follow a Ghettobird, you know, wandering this street and noticing how its perception of what's going on is different from what Peachtree Street's perception of it is going on versus the people who are actually on it, their perceptions of it. So yeah, I've been kind of fascinated. I want to kind of draw upon more of that to kind of pull, you know, some of these influences from, you know, my experience, you know, living in Atlanta, both its interesting aspects and its troublesome aspects.
In the pieces that you have, you see those different levels of awareness and coexistence. And I think that's the thing about it, is coexistence is not malevolent from one or the other. It's coexistence. It's like you said, it's evolving.
Yeah.
And I forget which one it was, but the one where the riders are on the train.
Cornelius of the Rock.
Oh my gosh. Like, oh,
the Soul Train.
Yeah, that was really deep. So tell me, how do we keep up with you? How do we find you?
Well, probably the most up-to-date way to find me nowadays is I'm on Facebook.
Okay.
Both under my normal name, Bryant O'Hara, but I do have a page, Bryant O'Hara _poet. And also I'm on Instagram under that same username, Bryant O'Hara _poet. And let's see, I'm on Twitter. I do have my own website, which I'm bad about updating, but it will be updated. Let's see, and the name of that website is intimateandintricate.com.
One of the things I always ask everybody who comes on here, because what I really like for these podcasts to do is to help other writers who are out there, just because first time out has taken on a really different meaning, because you can be any age, coming from any discipline, whatever. Just particularly with the upheaval 2 years ago, a lot of people have really considered doing other things than what they've been doing. And so my thing that I ask everybody who comes on the podcast is, what advice would you give to new artists or career changers or people who are finally dusting off that idea that they've had in the attic or the basement? What would you be your advice?
In terms, like, for folks that are kind of dusting off stuff, probably one thing I would recommend is be kind to yourself. It's very easy to kind of get into a mode where you're thinking like, why didn't I do this earlier? You know, why didn't I start earlier? Why didn't I, do this or that, or, whatever, what have you. The key is, as long as you're patient with yourself, but, intending to move forward, it's that is your best bet for being able to do this, achieve these sorts of goals, and not drive yourself nuts or guilt trip yourself into trying to get something done. I would recommend people be patient with yourself, but do the work. It's one other thing for new folks. I would say, good Lord, there are so many options. Don't be afraid to put it out in any way, shape, or form, especially if you're going to self-publish. Don't be afraid to put it out. If it doesn't look right, fix it. Do it again. We live in a publishing environment where the idea of, the technical jargon of fail fast, fail often, can just as easily apply to self-publishing. If you got to start stories and they didn't turn out well, you have many, many, many opportunities to rewrite them, turn them into different things, and keep doing it. If that's the story you got in you, keep doing it until it comes out in a way that you're satisfied with and somebody else will be satisfied with. All right, that's my spiel.
I like that, because like you said, there's so many opportunities, there's so many avenues. Even once you put out something that you might have written, I was just talking with another artist, author earlier, and it's like he's also a musician and he draws. So it's like, well, and he's like, well, I put books come out and I wish I had more things. And I said, well, you still have avenues to attach any kind of image you want to that material, because you have all these other outlets where you could promote your book.
Right.
You could use that image in that music. It didn't mention, like you're doing, if you ever decide to do an audio book, well, you could put your original songs that you've composed for the book on that audio book. So there's all kind of avenues and stuff. We are in a very unique time and space that I think started with the music, where you could literally produce music in your house and sell it out on the street, and then it kind of come to film and video, where you walk around with a production studio called a phone. And now with the publishing space too, where being self or indie published or even a small has become more acceptable. So as a creative person, it ain't a bad time to live in.
No, it's not. It is most definitely not.
But thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I love this. And like I said, I'm not kidding you. I always suggest it to people, because I know the title's going to get it in and of itself. It's like, what the hell is a Ghettobird? It's like, get it and read.
Yep.
But I really appreciate it. I really liked it. And that's why I really wanted to do the interview with you. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Urban Guru podcast. And of course, you can always find us on iTunes. Just search for Urban Guru and you'll find our podcast listed. You can also listen to this podcast on SoundCloud. Just search for Urban Guru Podcast and you'll be able to find it there too. Thank you again for listening. And remember, no matter whatever your creative endeavor is, always push forward, because every step that you take along that path will lead you to your ultimate destination. So I'll see you next time.